All right.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much for coming. That needs to go off the screen. I'm going to put that. Okay. Good evening. I'm happy to see you all and to introduce you, although I'm sure some of you don't need a first introduction, to a great poet, Alfred Lord Tennyson. Um, uh, he was the poet laureate in his time, and I'm going to go through his life and works tonight, some of his masterpiece, in Memoriam particularly, and give you a sense of the scope of his work. This is the earliest portrait of Tennyson. He was quite a handsome man, done by Samuel Lawrence, and it's in the period of his life before he grew his beard, which covered up that wonderful face, which is a shame. In 1850, the great poet Wordsworth, the great poet of Romanticism, died, and he was replaced in 1850 by Tennyson. His poetic voice dominated the Victorian age. He is perhaps the most quoted poet in Bartlett's familiar quotations. He rivals even Shakespeare. In the spring, a young man's fancy lightly turns to thoughts of love. 'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. Into the valley of death rode the 600, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. Nature red in tooth and claw. I could go on for quite a while. His lines stick in the mind, and that's important. And I want to make a comparison. I once attended a lecture by a wonderful art teacher at Framingham, Brucia Whithoff, on Vermeer. She invited me to come to her lecture because she knows that I love Vermeer. And in one of her slides, she showed one of Vermeer's paintings. You probably are familiar with it. He only did 32 of them. And it's usually of a woman sitting at a table, and there might be a man and a glass of wine and so on. And because they had developed X-ray technology, they were able to go into that painting and show the drawings and the preparation that Vermeer had made for the painting. And she said, you know, look at the table. He moved it 32 times until he got it just right. And it's right. It's in the right place. It can't be anywhere else. And that's how Tennyson's lines are. The words are just in the right place. And that's why we remember them. 'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. You'll never forget it. So he was a great lyric poet. Even in his lifetime, however, he began to be criticized, particularly because he wrote some medieval subjects, such as The Lady of Shalott and Idylls of the King. People wondered, why is he going back? We're in the modern period, the Victorian period. Well, one of the things that was happening was that as he died and his legacy was passed on, World War I occurred. And as one critic put it, the poison gases of World War I poisoned our taste for the verse of Tennyson. He went out of fashion after that. And sometimes we moderns are not fair to him. And we who have lived through World War II and the Holocaust and Hiroshima, these things which have further shaken our world, we may find it hard to keep in touch with him. And I'm hoping tonight that I will put you in touch with this very great poet. He was born on the 6th of August in 1809. It was at a moment when the brilliant generation of the poets of the previous generation were destined for premature extinction. Except for Wordsworth, they all died early. Keats, Shelley, and Byron all died in their 20s and early 30s, leaving Wordsworth and Coleridge, but they were more muted voices by the time Tennyson came of age. And of course, also born in 1809 was Charles Darwin, whose works, published in 1859 and afterwards, began to show the tensions between the old ideas of Christianity and what the world was all about and evolution. The world was changing. Tennyson is born into this world. He was the third son of the Reverend George Tennyson, who was a rector of Somersby. Tennyson was the fourth of 12 children. They used to have big families in those days. And 3 of his brothers suffered from mental illness and epilepsy. There was considerable mental instability in his family. His father was a very difficult man. He drank, he was given to depression, and yet this home of 12 children, although it was odd and eccentric, it was never an unhappy childhood. Still, the family was dominated by the father. His father disinherited him, and he became even more bitter. And he became, of course, an alcoholic in his later years. Tennyson's eldest brother once said of their father, "It's good we don't live in a barbarous country, or we should have murdered each other before this." Tennyson himself was moody, melancholic, truculent. There was a long list of failed friendships in his life, and he always had a morbid fear of having the epilepsy that hung over his family. As it turned out, it never did afflict him. Poetry was his anchor, and he lived a lonely, erratic, and eccentric existence. And yet he is one of the supreme poets in our language, even though our response to his poetry has radically changed. And yet, one of the first modern poets to appreciate him was T.S. Eliot. Actually, no poet of comparable magnitude has been so misread in our own time. He died in 1892, and T.S. Eliot wrote The Wasteland in 1922, and poetry was changed. And yet, Tennyson, I hope I'll show you tonight, is remarkably modern. He was both traditional and deeply original. In 1827, his father sent him to Cambridge. He was a kind of grubby guy, but by the age of 20, he had published 2 volumes of poetry, one together with one of his brothers. And these 2 volumes include some of his best early work. I'm going to go over 2 of his early poems with you tonight, and you may recognize some of them. At Cambridge, he met a young man who was almost universally admired, the brilliant and accomplished Arthur Henry Hallam. Hallam became Tennyson's great friend. They were linked by their love of poetry, their tendency to depression. Both of them got depressed occasionally, and they both had difficult fathers. Tennyson's father, as I've told you, was sometimes even physically violent. Hallam's father was violently ambitious for his talented son. Hallam also became engaged to one of Tennyson's sisters, so it became an even closer relationship. In 1833, Hallam's father took him on a visit to Vienna, and they were walking in the street one sunny day, and Hallam, at the age of 22, dropped dead. His death resulted in a remarkable outpouring of poetry from Tennyson. And that's what we're going to focus on tonight, because really that's our human characteristic. We're mortal. We know we're going to die. It's what distinguishes us from the animals. Animals, I don't care what they say about elephants' graveyards. Most animals don't know they're going to die, and we do. And this death of Hallam just hit Tennyson terribly. And he worked on this poem for 17 years. He didn't even know it was a single poem. He kept writing these small lyrics all about the death of Hallam. I want to stress that his attachment to Hallam was strong and close, but it was never sexual. A lot of modern writers, well, we're always looking for sex everywhere nowadays, think that somehow Tennyson was a closet homosexual. He wasn't. He was probably having sexual relations with women during these nomadic years of his early life, but his love for Hallam was the love of a man for a very best friend. Now I'm going to talk about 2 of his earlier poems. He wrote so much. I mean, his collected works are huge. And I'm going to first look at a poem called The Lotus Eaters. The Lotus Eaters is the companion piece to a more famous one of his earlier poems, Ulysses. I'm going to look over both of them. The Lotus Eaters, they express 2 moods of the human spirit. The Lotus Eaters expresses the mood that, it isn't worth it. Earthly toil isn't worth it. And the Ulysses expresses the opposite. Let's look first at the Lotus Eaters. It describes the episode in Book 9 of the Odyssey, in which Odysseus and his men arrive on an island where the inhabitants exist on lotus tree fruit. And when some of Odysseus's men eat the fruit, they fall into a trance and they say, let's forget about going home. We like it here. Let's have some pleasure. And going up a little bit, I've highlighted just a few lines here. It's a land where all things always seem the same. And round about the keel with faces pale, dark faces pale against that rosy flame, the mild-eyed, melancholy Lotus Eaters came. You'll notice that Tennyson rhymes. Almost all of his work is rhymed. We've gone away from that, starting with Whitman. Whitman didn't rhyme a thing. He wrote in something that was called free verse. And I remember my good friend, the poet Alan Feldman, saying, after Whitman, no one will ever rhyme again. Well, Robert Frost did, and some do. Hardy did. And it's not easy to rhyme and not make it sound sort of false. But Tennyson manages. Anyway, here the Lotus Eaters come. They don't want to go back. Odysseus's men don't want to go back. Going to the next section that I'm highlighting. Most weary seemed the sea, weary the oar, weary the wandering fields of barren foam. Then someone said, we will return no more. And all at once they sang, our island home is far beyond the wave. We will no longer roam. What follows then is the choric song, in which the men sing of their hopelessness and their desire for ease. And you'll see that it goes on there, I think 8 or 9 stanzas of this part. And at the end, they come up with their justification for not bothering to try to sail home. Surely now our household hearths are cold. Our sons inherit us. Our looks are strange. And we should come like ghosts to trouble joy. So, let's stay here. Interestingly enough, in the Odyssey itself, in Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus forces his unwilling men back to the ship, and they do eventually go home. But Tennyson's rendering is more ambiguous. The song ends, and we never hear the end. We just know that they like it here. So I think Tennyson went through that sort of period of his own life when he didn't really feel like he could do anything anymore. So in the Lotus Eaters, that's a wonderful poem. You should read the whole thing, but if I did the whole thing, we'd never get on to anything else. So the second of his great early poems is Ulysses. Ulysses is all about a ringing affirmation of life, especially in the face of old age and in the face of adversity. It doesn't mean if you grow old, you've got to go on, you've got to keep striving. And if you may remember, I believe, and I'll wait till we get to the end to mention this again, Robert Kennedy chose some lines from this poem as his mantra in the year that he was running for president. This poem is just a wonderful poem. It begins with Ulysses growing old. It little profits that an idle king by this still hearth among these barren crags, matched with an aged wife. I mean, he's gotten home, he's got Penelope. I mete and dole unequal laws unto a savage race that hoard and sleep and feed and know not me. He's restless again. I cannot rest from travel. I will drink life to the lees. So this is so different from the Lotus Eaters. And a little further down, I am become a name for always roaming with a hungry heart. Much have I seen and known, cities of men and manners, climates, councils, governments, myself not least, but honored of them all, and drunk delight of battle with my peers. And that's a wonderful line, far on the ringing plains of windy Troy. So Ulysses is thinking back to his triumphs in the Trojan War. I am a part of all that I have met. And here comes the very famous part of the poem. These lines are very famous. Yet all experience is an arch where through gleams that untraveled world whose margin fades forever and forever when I move. How dull it is to pause. He doesn't want to pause. Life piled on life for all too little. And of one, to me, little remains. He's eager to set sail again. And further on, he looks around and he sees his son Telemachus. This is my son. I give him my scepter and the isle. Let him do the common duties, pay meet adoration to my household gods. He works his work, I mine. He's willing to let his son take it over. He wants to go traveling again. And now the end of the poem again, the most famous part. There lies the port, the vessel puffs her sail. There gloom, the dark broad seas. What a wonderful use of the word gloom. We think of it as a noun usually, but here it's used as a verb. My mariners, he thinks about his mariners. Come, my friends, 'tis not too late to seek a newer world. Push off, let's go. Sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars until I die. It may be that the gulfs will wash us down. It may be we shall touch the happy isles. We may die and see the great Achilles. Of course, when Odysseus went into the underworld, he met Achilles. We're going to meet him again, whom we knew. Though much is taken, and that's, again, what is old age? Much is taken, much abides. And though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, one equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate. That's what happens when you grow old, but strong in will to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. It's just one of the most wonderful affirmations of the desire to do more no matter what. Well, those are two of, there are many, many more of his early poems that are great. Those, I think, are the two best. Anyway, following Helen's death, Tennyson became a suffering figure, rootless. He refused to find a job. He wouldn't work. He mooched off his friends. He was rejected by girls of his own class. He mainly went around with light skirt type women. He lost his father. He had no money. But amazingly, this is the most amazing thing about Tennyson. He had nothing. And he said, I'm not going to work at anything except being a poet. And eventually he made Helen's death, although I don't think he knew he was doing this, into material for his art, which bore fruit in his masterpiece, In Memoriam, the great poem which in 1850 made him world famous. He carried the manuscripts of this poem around with him for 17 years. He worked on it for 17 years. He used to read parts of it aloud to friends. Some of his friends copied parts into their notebooks. Sometimes he lost pieces of it. One time he left some in a hotel he stayed in, and a friend had to go and find it for him. Anyway, Helen was always in his mind. He was the one who had encouraged Tennyson in his early career. In 1837, Tennyson became engaged to Emily Selwood. They fell in love, but of course her father wouldn't tolerate this. I mean, this was a vagabond. This guy was a bum. He wouldn't let his daughter even think of marrying him. Of course, they were secretly engaged. I think her father resisted, first of all, because his family was unstable. Three of them wound up in mental hospitals. They had epilepsy. The father was disinherited. He was an alcoholic. Think about it. It was a terrible kind of testimony for Emily Selwood's father. Also, Tennyson began to have a lot of religious doubt. I mean, this is the period of time in the history of the world when there begin to be all kinds of cracks into what people thought about the world, the age of the world, the validity of the book of Genesis, the new science, all the rest of it.
Dr. Heineman, there's a question.
Yes.
Sebastian.
Question.
Yeah.
Question?
And the question is, so did Helen drop dead from poetry?
Did Helen write poetry?
I think he said, did Hallam drop dead from poetry?
Oh, no, he had a brain aneurysm.
Oh,
It was a brain aneurysm, and it was very sudden. And he just dropped dead walking next to his father in the streets, afternoon streets in Vienna. So anyway, Tennyson is writing along. He tried a long poem, The Princess. People didn't like it. I don't think it's one of his best. But he was very handsome. A lot of people commented on his physical beauty. Here is now Tennyson in his later, this is sort of maybe in his 30s. He grew a beard, he wore long hair, and he always wore this hat and a long Spanish cloak. I mean, he just looked eccentric. He was eccentric, but he looked eccentric. And he was a tremendous smoker. He smoked and smoked and smoked right to the very end of his life. And he was often unwell. He was just an outsider type figure. And as I said, he was always losing things. He left he lost almost a large part of In Memoriam. He had written it out in a butcher's account book, and he didn't have paper, so he used a butcher's account book. And butcher's books had a sort of a film on them to prevent them from getting dirty in the butcher's shop. And later on, some of the people called In Memoriam the butcher verses. Anyway, but Emily, who was seeing these poems that he was writing, appreciated him, although they had to at some point break off their engagement. But she said, I am the happier and the better for having known him and having seen these poems. She had tremendous faith in him. The poems were crucial in bringing them together much later on. By 1849, they agreed to try to marry, but they kept it secret. In fact, they married in secret. Nobody came to the wedding, but Tennyson wrote to a friend, Emily and I are married. We seem to get on very well together. I have not beaten her yet, because that was his sense of humor. But he commemorated her in a brief verse. Good she is, and pure and just. Being conquered by her sweetness, I shall come through her, I trust, into fuller orbed completeness, though but made of erring dust. Very nice tribute to her. He was over 40 when he married her, and she was 36. And of course, he had lived a life of complete freedom. He never had to work. He just sort of rattled around and got along. And anyway, in 1850 is his big year, the year he marries and that he eventually publishes In Memoriam. It was Emily who told him, this is one poem. This is not a bunch of poems. This is one poem. 1850 is an interesting year. In this year, 3 great autobiographical works are published. Wordsworth's Prelude is published. It was posthumous publication because he had died, but his wife published it and gave it its name. These women, there are many women that we don't recognize enough who gave their lives to these men in order for them to completely realize themselves. So Wordsworth's The Prelude is published in 1850, which is a story of his coming to life as a poet. Dickens publishes David Copperfield, which is his life story. And Tennyson publishes In Memoriam. Imagine this, 3 masterpieces in one year. I always call 1850 the annus mirabilis of English literature. In Memoriam, Tennyson wrote about his honest doubt about what the world is all about. It was published anonymously, although from day one, everyone knew who had written it. And he always required that subsequent editions would not have his name on the title page. And he never explained who AHH was. It was called In Memoriam, AHH, which was Arthur Henry Helen. The structure of In Memoriam, and it has a structure, it's structured around 3 Christmases. It begins in grief and it passes on to triumph. At first, the poet thinks only of loss and death. And by the end, he has a vision of a new and greater life. He intended the poem to portray a resolution of doubt by faith, but the question must be raised as we will go through it tonight. Can 21st century readers who have lived through 2 world wars, Auschwitz, Hiroshima, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, if you want, take seriously Tennyson's belief in human progress and his hope of immortality? Can we accord this poem our respect? And that's what I hope to show you tonight, even though we don't have time to go through the whole thing, of course. The poem has 3 crucial episodes or points. The first is that you must see human beings in the light of recent scientific knowledge. He accepted science, he accepted Darwin, he accepted Lyell and geology, and then they were discovering that the earth was far older than anyone had thought. He accepted the fact that they were discovering fossils in the White Cliffs of Dover, that these were cliffs that were once at the bottom of the ocean. We cannot understand human beings without without accepting whatever science is presenting to us. That's number one.
I'm sorry, we've got a question in the chat. Did Tennyson publish any poetry prior to In Memoriam, and was he paid for any of his poetry?
He was not paid so much, but he was given by the government a stipend. It's a great tribute. A lot of people think of the Victorians as stuffy stuff, but we don't do that for our poets. We don't give them stipends so that they can have a living and still try writing. It's very hard to be a poet because it takes a lot to earn money from it. Maybe Billy Collins has been able to support himself. He was a very popular poet in our time. I think Robert Frost was able to support himself, but my goodness, there's a lot of magnificent poets who don't earn enough to live on, and they have to do other things. But the Victorians gave successful poets, Tennyson, they recognized as being a voice of their generation. And he was given, I think it was 700 pounds a year. I forget what the number is, but he was given a stipend because he never worked. He never worked for a living. He simply wouldn't. He was writing all the time. All right.
Did he publish any poetry prior to In Memoriam?
Oh, yes. He published the 2 early volumes of poetry, that one with the Lotus Eaters and Ulysses. He published The Princess. He published, he's got, I'll just show you for one example. Here's my copy of Tennyson. It's huge. It's huge. The poems, and he wrote plays. He wrote, there's Juvenilia, he wrote a volume called The Lady of Shalott and other poems, English Idols and other poems, The Princess. That's all before In Memoriam. So he had a good corpus of work before he wrote In Memoriam. But In Memoriam made him a national figure and made him famous. It also it gave him the title that he was given, Alfred Lord Tennyson. Okay, so the first thing is seeing the human phenomenon in the light of recent science. The second crucial point of In Memoriam is doubt afflicts modern people. Much more than, I don't know, I mean, I guess there's some doubt in Chaucer, not much, or some of the earlier poets, probably in Shakespeare. It's here and there, but in our modern period, really, doubt is prevalent and dominant. And Tennyson said, we must recognize it. That's the second point of In Memoriam. And the third is, what shape can belief take if we are to survive? If we're recognizing doubt, how can we survive? What shape can we have for our beliefs? Well, he studied science. He was very much aware of very well read. He had a huge library I visited his house at Farringford. It's a gigantic library. They've kept it. And he's very much aware that our biological past stretched back to the very dim origins of life. And he was also aware of the fact there was a new astronomy coming in, that our planet is only a tiny globe spinning through an immeasurable universe. And it's not tailored to our measure all the time. So that's why I say Tennyson is a very modern poet. The immediate result of this is a kind of doubt about the meaning of human existence, and especially when a brilliant, wonderful guy like Helen drops dead in the street. What does God have to do with something like that? Well, we can pull it all the way up to Auschwitz. What does God have to do with all of this? Hallam's death left him with trying to cope with the meaning of the death's challenge to faith. So the answer, and I think there's some answer, well, I hope I'll be able to get to it tonight, is not popular Christianity with its literal reading of Genesis. They had people in the Victorian period calculating how many years the earth was in existence when Adam and Eve were created and all of that. Eventually, he comes to another kind of belief and progress. Spiritual, I guess you could say. He has a strong dash of the mystic, which goes together with his lifelong interest in science, and he sees the world from this double perspective. It's wonderful. On the one hand, there's the rational science, and the other hand, there's something else. There's something else. It's like Pascal saying, the heart has its reasons, which the mind and the reason cannot know. So in this poem, the reader will relive with Tennyson the shock of loss, the collapse of faith, the struggle to achieve balance, mystical intuitions, dawning hope, and I think it ends positively. Hopefully, you and the poem will be in accord when I finally get it to its conclusion. It consists of 132 quatrains. Quatrain is a verse of 4 lines, and it's usually A, B, or it's A, C, D, whatever. You know how that goes with quatrains. And yet there is never monotony. There is never repetition. And the poem really has to be comprehended as a whole. There was no way for me to do excerpts of In Memoriam. You really have to see the kind of sweep of the whole. It's unique. It's a long poem put together, made by putting together short lyrics. It's like the diary of a man who is confessing himself. His contemporaries regarded it as a message of hope. Tennyson expressed that hope, but at the same time, he was expressing his doubt. And that's what's so interesting about the poem. It's bipolar, I guess you could say. He is very distressed by the idea of a merely mechanical universe. He is teased by the hope of immortality and reunion beyond death. And In Memoriam is a religious poem in that it contains both faith and doubt. He was, and this is again, it's strange to say, he was in some respects the most perfect conformist to his society. And on the other hand, he was the biggest rebel against it. He managed to keep these things in suspension, particularly in this poem. Poem has 4 sections. I'm going to go over the sections bit by bit. Section 1 is verses 1 to 27. We can begin that here. I want to just say before I begin it, I want to give you a quote from T.S. Eliot, which is so interesting because we don't think of T.S. Eliot, we think of him as very modern, The Wasteland, obviously, right? Or The Beginning of Prufrock, the patient etherized on a table. But Eliot said that Tennyson is a great poet because he has 3 qualities which are seldom found together except in the greatest poets. And the 3 qualities are abundance, Shakespeare, huge. Chaucer, huge. Dickens, huge. These aren't people who wrote one book or one poem or one volume. It's interesting you asked me how much he wrote. He wrote a tremendous amount. Eliot says this is the first characteristic of a great poet, abundance. Think about Dickens. What he wrote 14 masterpieces, 14 novels. Nowadays, if somebody writes one or two, they think they're great. 14. Trollope, God knows how many, 40. So what is the characteristic of a great poet? Eliot says, number one, abundance. But that's not all. Number two is variety. You can't have abundance that's monotonous. It has to have variety, and Tennyson's works are full of variety. In Memoriam is only one of his voices. And third, Eliot says, complete competence. I mean, Tennyson is an expert poet, expert. So now let's take a look at In Memoriam. In the first section, which contains verses 1 through 27, they're all little lyrics. Some of them are just 4 lines, some are 8 lines, some are 12 lines. It varies. So he begins, we have but faith. We cannot know, for knowledge is of things we see. And yet we trust it comes from thee, from God. A beam in darkness, let it grow. You know, we trust there must be something beyond this. And then he makes an apology for his poem. Forgive these wild and wandering cries, confusions of a wasted youth. Forgive them where they fail in truth, and in thy wisdom make me wise. So it's a kind of invocation. And then going on, he talks about the world, the stars blindly run. We're all involved with that nowadays. Black holes, the universe expanding. We're sending up all kinds of inquiries. A web is woven across the sky. From out waste places comes a cry and murmurs from the dying sun. It's the first time anybody thought that there might be planets and even the sun that might be dying. And he sees nature as a phantom, a hollow form with empty hands. Okay? And then he thinks about this and he says, I sometimes hold it half a sin to put in words the grief I feel. For words, like nature, half reveal and half conceal the soul within. He wonders whether he can put in words. And then he says, well, he's nothing else to do. In words like weeds, I'll wrap me o'er, like coarsest clothes against the cold. But that large grief which these enfold is given an outline and no more. So the words aren't enough. They're the best he can do, but he thinks of the limitation of trying to write about this. Okay, then the next section, he goes to Hallam's house. Of course, it's empty now. Dark house, by which once more I stand here in the long, unlovely street. Doors where my heart was used to beat so quickly, waiting for a hand. I mean, this was a place he would go and he would see Hallam and he'd take his hand. He is not here, but far away, the noise of life begins again, and ghastly through the drizzling rain, on the bald street breaks the blank day. Look at that last line with the alliterations of the bees and their spondees. On the bald street breaks the blank day. It stops the verse. This is how he feels when he goes by the house. Okay, and then he ends this first section. I hold it true, whate'er befall, I felt it when I sorrow most. 'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. So that ends section 1. Section 2, 28 to 77, begins again with an assertion. My own dim life should teach me this, that life shall live forevermore. I mean, that's what we feel. We feel we should live forevermore. Else earth is darkness at the core, and dust and ashes, all that is. Yes, okay. And then he thinks about himself and Hallam. My paths, he, Tennyson, are in the field I know, and thine in undiscovered lands. And then he begins to think about what's it like to be dead? And he asks the question, how fares it with the happy dead? For here the man is more and more. I mean, we keep growing, we keep changing. You ever get those people saying, when we get resurrected, what age are we going to be? All these questions, which nobody can answer that. It's kind of a silly question. But he forgets the days before God shut the doorways of his head. What an interesting image. We forget, you see, remember a child, babies have that soft spot, I forget the name of it, on the top of the head, and eventually it closes. It's like Wordsworth saying, our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. You know, we came from somewhere we don't remember. The days have vanished, those wherever we came from, tone and tint, and yet perhaps the hoarding sense gives out at times, he knows not whence, a little flash, a mystic hint. Maybe once in a while we get some indication. I love that, the hoarding sense, hoarding. Even though this thing closes on our head, we're hoarding some memories, okay. And then he comes back to his poems again, thinks about his brief lays of sorrow born. You know, he says, they can't close grave doubts. I can't finish with doubt. That's a very important stanza. He's not writing these things to close your doubts. Nor dare she, sorrow, trust a larger lay. We can't get rid of our sorrow, but rather loosens from the lip. The only thing our lips get loosened to give short swallow flights of song that dip their wings in tears and skim away. Okay, again, a justification for his writing. Well, then he says, you know, he's in his grief, and he asks, be near me when my light is low, when the blood creeps and the nerves prick and tingle and the heart is sick and all the wheels of being slow. It's interesting that he uses the word wheels. Remember, this is the age of the coming of the railroad, and the sense of, you know, the wheels of being are slowing down. And be near me when my faith is dry. You know, my faith is dry. And men, the flies of latter spring that lay their eggs and sting and die and sting and sing and weave their petty cells and die. You know, what is humanity? What is human life? And he's very low here, okay? Next, but we trust that somehow good will be the final goal of ill. We're trusting this, that nothing walks with aimless feet. Do we believe that? That not one life shall be destroyed or cast as rubbish to the void when God hath made the pile complete. That's what we trust. He doesn't say we know it. He says we trust that somehow there's a purpose to all of this, that every life is worth something, and he's holding on to this. Okay, next. He goes on with it, that not a worm is cloven in vain, that not a moth with vain desire is shriveled in a fruitless fire, or but subserves another's gain, even a moth. Behold, we know not anything. I can but trust that good shall fall at last, far off at last to all, and every winter change to spring. Okay. So runs my dream. Now he's coming back to reality. It's a dream, but what am I? An infant crying in the night, an infant crying for the light, and with no language but a cry. I mean, this to me is one of the most brilliant and complete expressions of doubt. At the same time, I'm trying to trust, but I'm doubting. Okay. Man, her last work, you know, we thought man was so fair, had such a splendid purpose, who trusted God was love. I mean, how can you say that when you think about Auschwitz? How can you think about it when you think of anything, of your best friend dropping dead in the street for no reason? And you thought that love was creation's final law. And now we get the Darwinian struggle for existence, though nature red in tooth and claw. Wordsworth would never have written those lines. Wordsworth never saw nature red in tooth and claw. We're moving into the modern world with Raven shrieked against his creed. And then, oh, life as futile, then as frail. Oh, for thy voice to soothe and bless. What hope of an answer or redress? And his answer is behind the veil, behind the veil. We don't know. We don't know. Okay. And then he comes back to that. He repeats the lines. He knows they're pretty good. The truth came. I felt it when I sorrowed most. 'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. It is better to have loved and lost. That's a lot to take, you know, because everybody experiences loss. Every relationship in the world ends in loss. I used to say to my students, there's only one that doesn't, and it's student and teacher. It's 15 weeks and it's up. And you can't go on with it. But every relationship we have, we want it to go on. And yet we know we're going to lose it. And yet Tennyson writes, 'tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. And he thinks back again to what happened in Vienna's fatal walls. God's finger touched him and he slept. Okay. I remained, whose hopes were dim, whose life, whose thoughts were little worth, to wander on a darkened earth where all things round me breathed of him. I mean, he loved Helen. Okay. A hunger seizes his heart. And this is the most crucial, these are the most crucial two stanzas in the poem. In parts that I can't excerpt everything, he's reading old letters that Helen wrote him. It's often true, isn't it, that I wonder what this generation of email is going to do about it. But sometimes if you have letters and you can read them, they bring back the past. They bring a person back. And he's reading Helen's letters. A hunger seized my heart. I read of that glad year which once had been, in those fallen leaves which kept their green, the noble letters of the dead. And then there's some other stanzas. You see my dots that I excerpt. So he's reading. So word by word and line by line, the dead man touched me from the past. And that's his epiphany. He has some kind of experience. He can't put it any other way except in a touch. Through reading these letters, the dead man touched me from the past, and all at once, it seemed at last, the living soul was flashed on mine. This is what I guess you could call it a mystic experience, an epiphany, some sense that he's in touch with Helen for a moment. Next, vague words. The minute he writes it down, he doesn't like it. Vague words, but how hard to frame in matter molded forms of speech, or even for intellect to reach through memory, that which I became. He is touched by the experience. He is changed by it. I remember once hearing, this Sister Wendy, who became so famous through writing about art. And she was interviewed in a program that ran on PBS, and somebody asked her, have you ever had an experience of God, direct? And she said, oh, yes. And she said, oh, yes, I was on a train, and she talked about, and she had this experience. And that's the interviewer said to her, and she was just very young. And the interviewer said to her, well, did you have another one? She said, why would I have another one? Isn't one enough? And the way she answered it, well, one for Tennyson is enough. It gave him something. Okay. And then next, he goes from the vague words. He's still perplexed in faith, but pure in deeds. At last he beat his music out. Here's the answer. There lives more faith in honest doubt, believe me, than in half the creeds. I mean, these are very simple words, but he's expressing something very big here. Okay, next. This is the last section now. He has said this faith in doubt. He comes to that. And now in the last section, which is stanza number 104 to the end, ring out wild bells to the wild sky. This is the end of that third Christmas. It's going to be New Year's. The year is going, let him go. Ring out the false, ring in the true. Okay. Next. Yet less of sorrow lives in me. He's gotten rid of some of it. For days of happy commune dead. He's less of sorrow for what is gone than some strong bond which is to be. He's looking in the future. All right. And he says, this is like the understatement of the year. I trust I have not wasted breath. I hope not. I think we are not wholly brain. We're not all rationality. We're not all brain. Magnetic mockeries, not in vain. There's more to us than our brain, okay? And then he begins to think again about the world. There rolls the deep where grew the tree. O earth, what changes hast thou seen? He thinks about the tremendous age of the earth, okay? And he continues here in the next, the hills are shadows and they flow from form to form. Nothing stands. Everything is changing in the world. They melt like mist, the solid lands like clouds. They shape themselves and go. It's part of human experience that everything passes. Go on. But he says, in my spirit will I dwell and dream my dream. He said, it's a dream and hold it true. For though my lips may breathe adieu, I cannot think the thing farewell. Interesting. And then he goes on again to think about out of darkness comes the hand of God that molds men. And then the next, he thinks about the voice of Helen is on the air. I hear thee where the waters run. Thou standest in the rising sun, and in the setting thou art fair. And he says far off thou art. He's gone, but he has him still, and I rejoice. I prosper. Circle with thy voice. I shall not lose thee, though I die. Well, by the year's end, 60,000 copies of In Memoriam had been sold. The abbreviation, as I told you, was never explained. It was cryptic, but everybody knew Tennyson had wrote it. The reviews were very favorable. People saw it as a tale of real human sorrow. T.S. Eliot said, the religious faith in Tennyson's In Memoriam is a poor thing, but its doubt is a very intense experience. I taught the whole poem once. I was teaching a Victorian period course, and I taught the whole poem. And we had a break. It was an evening class of 4 hours, and we had a break. And I'll never forget this woman who came up to me, and she was just tears in her eyes. And she said, Dr. Heineman, I can't go on. She said, I lost my son, I don't know, very recently. And she said, I'm going to go home with the poem and read it, but I just can't bear anymore. And it was so powerful to this modern woman who was trying to come to terms with something terrible that had happened, a death that she had to absorb. It is a very moving poem. Upon its publication, Tennyson was definitely the major poet of the day. It was a massive success. As I told you, Tennyson and Emily finally get married. They go on a honeymoon to the lake country, beautiful landscape. And I love the story that they rented this honeymoon cottage, and he would go, he loved to compose while walking. It's interesting, Dickens walked all the time. There's something about walking. Thoreau walked a lot. Wordsworth and Dorothy walked hundreds of thousands of miles, and he composed. Well, anyway, Tennyson would go out during the day and walk by himself, and she had to paint the door white so that he would find his way back, because he would go walking and he would just be, somewhere else, and he had to get home. Anyway, he was invited to succeed Wordsworth as poet laureate. He brooded over it for 4 days, and finally he accepted it. Emily devoted her whole life to him, her whole intelligence, her whole energy. He would never have been able to be what he was, I think, without her. I don't think so. She became pregnant right away. They were out walking somewhere. She fell, and their first child was stillborn. He took her to Italy to recover, where they met Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and they became great friends and always regarded each other with mutual affection. Browning had a very small public. Tennyson recognized him as a great poet. Browning was he's a very tough poet to read. Tennyson is easy to read. Everything is totally clear. Browning, you have to really work on, and his poetry was seen as rough and difficult. But Tennyson had faith that he would be discovered, and eventually was. Emily eventually bore 2 sons, and here is a picture. I love this picture of their family in somewhat later life. You can see in her posture her total devotion to him. And of course, the boys were dressed in somewhat vaguely medieval clothes. I mean, they were a totally close family. The older one, he named Helen, after Helen, and the other one was Lionel. And I love this recollection. Helen was so devoted to his father. He took care of him to the very end. And Helen wrote once of his childhood, "He made us, as much as possible, his little companions. My mother was not strong. She couldn't walk as far as we did." They lived in Farringford. I was very privileged to travel to Farringford, took a tour there. We ate in Farringford in Tennyson's home, but the home is sort of on a promontory, and you have to walk very far out to get to the ocean. And she couldn't make it. So Hallam writes, "My father would harness my brother and myself to her garden carriage, and he himself pushed from behind. And in this fashion, we managed uphill and down dale. When the days were warm and we sat together in our fields, he would read to us. In cold weather, he played football with us, or he built castles of flint, or he would teach us to shoot with bow and arrow. If it was rainy or stormy and we were kept indoors, he built cities for us with bricks." This is pre-Lego. We played shuttlecock. He read us Grimm's fairy tales. He sung us ballads. And he was a wonderful father, and she a mother. He wrote every day. The next thing he wrote after In Memoriam was another long poem called Maud. And it's totally different. I don't like Maud very much. It's a brilliant poem. It's mad. It's violent. It's bloodstained. It's a monologue, and it mystified the public. They wanted more In Memoriam. It got bad reviews. One critic wrote, "There is an extra letter in Maud, and the title should have been either Mad or Mud." Tennyson said of the poem, "Well, I took a man who was diseased, and I dipped him into the circumstances of the time." It helped him to know that Browning, I'm not surprised, Browning admired Maud. In 1855, England entered the Crimean War, and Tennyson wrote a very famous poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade. You've all, I'm sure, have encountered it. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. It's about a military catastrophe. It's about military generals having these guys ride into a valley with the enemy on either side on the cliffs and get massacred. It's about a mix-up. We've had a lot of those. We know what that is. And Tennyson wrote this poem. And do you know, it's just a wonderful poem. Put up yet some more stanzas here. "Forward the right brigade. Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Thomas Edison, who had just invented the phonograph, traveled to England to record Tennyson reading aloud The Charge of the Light Brigade. I have a little tape of it. It's not worth playing for anyone. You can hardly recognize it, but you hear this sonorous voice of Tennyson, cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them. Anyway, it was a very popular poem. Now his fame became a problem. Okay, we can move up from The Charge of the Light Brigade. It's a wonderful poem. You should read it aloud. It's got to be read aloud. His fame became a problem. There was a steady stream of visitors, constant. People did this. If you ever read the biography of George Washington, people came to Mount Vernon all the time and they had to take them in. I mean, it's amazing. And Tennyson and his wife, the same way. Anyway, the next thing he writes is his next masterpiece. I wish we had time to go over it. We don't. Idylls of the King, 1859, the story of King Arthur and the Round Table. He had been working on it since 1830. It appeared in 12 books. The central theme was how the sexual drive could derail all human designs. The brilliant, courageous, noble court of King Arthur was going to be so slowly destroyed by the effects of Guinevere's adultery with Lancelot. It was a big national work. It expressed metaphorically the aspirations of the age and the forces driving against it. You may recognize these lines from it. Now the whole round table is dissolved, which was an image of the mighty world. And I, the last, go forth companionless, and the days darken round me, and the years among new men, strange faces, other minds. The old order changeth, yielding place to new, and God fulfills himself in many ways, lest one good custom should corrupt the world. Again, isn't that something about human activity, that it reaches a peak and then something happens? You know, Gibbon writing The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, we hope we're not in the decline of our own, but you know, things grow and grow and then they decline. It's just a wonderful work, and it's 12 books. It's very big, but it's wonderful. Okay, he was now prosperous and successful. Emily devoted her life to him. She spent about 7 hours a day just answering his correspondence. She did all the finances. They had a relationship of deep mutual understanding. She took care of everything, and she left him free to write. The toll on her was very great, and in the end, she became ill. Well, in her last years, she suffered from exhaustion, and Helen took over as his father's secretary and caregiver. I'm going to end with his last great poem. One day, he was crossing on a ferry from Lymington to Yarmouth. It's a 20-minute crossing. I've made it myself with my tour group. It's a short distance, and over this short distance, he composed the poem we know as Crossing the Bar. He jotted it down on an old envelope. He was 81 years old, and the poem had come to him in a flash. Normally, he composed slowly, revising constantly. This was different. After dinner, he showed what he had written to his son, Helen, who said, "This is the crown of your life's work. This is one of the most beautiful poems ever written." Tennyson answered, "It came to me in a moment." A few days before his death, he called his son to his bedside and said, "Mind, you put Crossing the Bar at the end of all editions of my poems, and it has been done that way ever since. You cannot buy a collection of Tennyson, but that this poem is the last." And I'm going to read it to you. We'll talk a little bit about it very briefly. Crossing the Bar. Sunset and evening star, and one clear call for me. And may there be no moaning at the bar when I put out to sea, but such a tide as moving seems asleep, too full for sound and foam, when that which drew from out the boundless deep turns again home. Twilight and evening bell, and after that the dark, and may there be no sadness of farewell when I embark. For though from out our bourne of time and place the flood may bear me far, I hope to see my pilot face to face when I have crossed the bar. Well, one more poem, and I'll end with this one because I do want to pay this tribute to Emily, which Tennyson paid. In his very last volume of poems, a volume called The Death of Benoni, He offered this tribute to his wife, and it's a poem, it's just one sentence. There on the top of the down, the wild heather round me, and over me June's high blue. When I looked at the bracken so bright and the weather so brown, I thought to myself, I would offer this book to you, this and my love together, to you that are 77, with a faith as clear as the heights of the June blue heaven, and a fancy as summer new as the green of the bracken amid the gloom of the heather. And I think he saw himself as the gloom of the heather and his wife as the hopeful green of the bracken. Well, I'll stop there. There's so much more that anyone could say, and I'll take questions now about this wonderful poet, Alfred Lord Tennyson, or comments. You don't have to ask a question, you can make a comment.
Please feel free to unmute yourselves or place something in the chat. And I'd love to ask a question. I think you might have already answered it, but I was thinking to myself throughout this presentation how magnificent it was to hear you read it out loud. And I'd love to know, when you're reading poetry on your own, do you like to read it out loud or do you read it in your head?
Poetry, good poetry should be read out loud. It really should. Remember, it began in the oral tradition. Even the Odyssey and the Iliad were read aloud to their audiences. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales were read aloud. Audiences heard Shakespeare's plays. They never read them. It's so sad to have children stuck with Shakespeare to read just the words and not see it dramatized the way it was meant to be. I think poetry should be read aloud. And you know, we don't do enough of it. Every once in a while, when I drive somewhere in town or take a walk, and I'll see a young woman out. It's always a woman. Sometimes it's a man, but mainly women do this. And they're wheeling a stroller, and there's a child in there. That child might be, I don't know, 3 or 4. And the woman is on the phone. She's talking to somebody else. She could be reading a poem to that child. She could be, talking, reading, hearing the human voice is a wonderful thing. So yes, I think poetry should be read aloud. And that's why we have poetry readings.
We have a question in the chat. He lived the same years as Walt Whitman. Did they know of each other?
Oh, yes. And I have a wonderful quote. I didn't use it because I thought I was running out of time. I'm going to read it to you now. He knew Whitman. He liked Whitman. Whitman was composing a new and different kind of verse. As I told you, it was free verse. It didn't bother Tennyson. They became great friends and died within a few months of each other in 1892. And I love this quote from Whitman. People asked Whitman, well, what does Tennyson think of you? And Whitman said, I don't think he ever quite makes me out, but he thinks I belong. Perhaps that is enough. All I ought to expect. I love that. Whitman, with that great generosity, he said, I belong. I belong to the company of poets. I'm different. I sound my barbaric yawp across the world, the things that Whitman wrote in a very different, but very poetic in its own way. Rhyme is so hard. You could read In Memoriam with your eye. If someone read it to you, you might not even be conscious of the rhyme because the language is so simple and perfect. Rhyme that calls attention to itself isn't perhaps as right for a poem like that. So yes, he knew Whitman and they were friends. Isn't that great? And they died in the same year. You don't even think of that, do you? You think of Whitman as being more modern, but that's because Tennyson has bad press. Tennyson is a modern poet. Okay. Other questions?
Can you recommend a scholarly edition of the complete Tennyson poems and also a scholarly biography?
Well, yes, I can. The Modern Library, I really recommend. The Modern Library, it's going to be inexpensive. It's got a pretty good print. And the Tennyson biography, I don't think I have it out here anymore, but I used it. And I'll go and when I'm finished, I'll go get it and put the title up. Okay, the author. Forget the author now. I don't think I wrote it. But there's a new modern biography and it's very good.
Since Tennyson wrote a poem on the Arthurian theme, how did he conceive of the concept of chivalry? And can we talk about chivalry in Victorianism?
Well, we can talk about it, the whole notion of chivalry, which had to do with the reverence of the woman and caring for the woman, taking care of the woman, which was in much early poetry. And feminism has changed some of that. There are women who don't like it when men open the door for them. Feminism has put a different slant on it because things never stay the same. Let's put it that way. But chivalry had to do with a reverence and a caring and a respect for the woman. And then what happened in the Victorian period, and it wasn't a good thing really, because remember, in the Middle Ages, often the knights went off to fight battles and the women stayed and took care of things. They were very capable. But there came this concept at the end of the Victorian period, and it was epitomized in a poem by Coventry Patmore called The Angel in the House. And the idea was the woman was almost ethereal and had to be, reverenced in such a way that it really was obsessive and demeaning in some respects. And women began to rise up against it. They wanted the vote, they wanted to work, all the rest of that. And in our period of time, the notion of chivalry, I think, is pretty dead. I don't know. My sister was 15 years older than I was, and her husband, I'll never forget, that man, my sister never got into a car without her husband opening the car door for her. And when I used to ride on the subway with Frank, he simply couldn't sit down if a woman was standing. It was impossible for him. She didn't have to be old or pregnant or sick. That was how he was brought up. So that whole idea of chivalry and all of the love poems exalting the woman and her beauty, some of that, a lot of it has changed with the birth of feminism. So is it dead? Well, certainly the concept of the angel in the house is dead. Because women have proven themselves equal to do many things. I mean, I don't think we can be football players. Maybe it'll be someday. I don't know, but it's a kind and the Round Table was founded on this idea of the knights going out and doing battle and taking care of women and all the rest of it. It dies in the court of Arthur in Tennyson's poem when Guinevere has sex with Lancelot. It's a betrayal, and the Round Table is finished. Maybe that whole concept of the woman is finished. It's Idylls of the King is a wonderful poem. It's very, very modern. And if it were a little shorter, I'd make a go at it. But even in 4 weeks, it's 12 books. I meditated. I got so involved with Tennyson doing this lecture. I meditated perhaps doing it in the spring in my class, but I don't know. And it's blank verse. It's blank verse. It's not rhymed. It's like Paradise Lost, 12 books, the Odyssey, 12 books. It's a tradition. Tennyson was a traditional poet.
What do you think Tennyson would have made of all that scientists are learning today about the brain? In Memoriam, AHH seems to include reflections on not just the limits of language, but also of thinking itself.
I think he would have been right in there and somehow absorbed it and expressed it. His library contained all the recent books on science, on geology, astronomy, Darwin. I think he would be right there. He would absorb it all and maybe put it into his works. He would have to. He was that kind of poet. As Dickens was that kind of writer. Dickens wrote about his society. He wrote about what was going on, what was happening. in industrialism and also in the relations between men and women. I think Tennyson was looking at that too. So my answer is he would have included it. I don't know what he would have said. He would have known more than I do because I don't have a particularly curious scientific mind. I just don't. But he did.
Well, we are quickly running out of time, but is there anything in particular you'd like us to take away just from the brief glimpse you've given us tonight?
Well, I think it wouldn't be a bad thing to read in Memoriam because I've given you a capsule presentation of it, and maybe you might even try to read Idylls of the King someday. I think those are his two masterpieces. I do, and they're worth reading. But you have this background anyway that I've given you to In Memoriam, and I think you maybe it would make a good read for you. But read some Tennyson. He's just a great poet, no question about it. I'll get the name of that of the Tennyson biography and give it to you so you can give it out to people.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Heineman, for your insights and your scholarship tonight. Before we let you go for the evening, we do have Anne Roberti here with us. Anne, do you want to say anything about the Adventures program?
So if you haven't registered, Adventures starts on Tuesday, and registration is open through Sunday into Monday morning. I know a lot of you, and see you in the audience tonight, have registered, so we're looking forward to delving into hard times with Dr. Heineman, and we're offering a variety of other courses too. We have a course in intro to Brazilian pop music, we have a nutrition course, we have an art course, and Dave Smales is coming back, and so we have some political science thrown in. So if you haven't registered yet, you can go to the library website or Framingham State's website, and we'd love to see you on Tuesday.
Let me just tell you, here's the book. It's Tennyson, To Strive, to Seek, to Find by John Batchelor, Batchlor. It's a very, very good, it's the most recent biography, and I think you'll enjoy it if you read it. I love connecting biography and writing. I think it's essential.
I'm sorry, and we have a question for you in the chat. The dates of the Adventures program?
Tuesdays, the 4 Tuesdays in October. So October 5th, October 12th, October 19th, and October 26th. And Dr. Heineman's class is at first thing in the morning, 9 o'clock to 10:30. So if you haven't registered, do that now.
And the book is Hard Times. And the reading for the first meeting is, Hard Times is published in three books: Sowing, Reaping, and Garnering. And I probably won't cover it all, but you should read for the first session, Sowing, the first Sowing, in Dickens's Hard Times. And it's written in 1854. It's very contemporary with Tennyson.
Yeah, so someone has asked me, we have different class, so they're usually, a class is an hour and a half, so from 9:30 to 10:30, then 10:45 to 12:15. Then there's a lunch break, and then in the afternoon, we have a class from 1:15 to 2:45, and another class from 1:30 to 3. So you can decide on your own schedule. If you only want to register for one course, that's great. If you want to attend all the classes in a day, and many people do, you can do the same. And it's free or for a voluntary donation. So if you have the time and you have access to Zoom, we really welcome you joining us.
All right, well, thank you so much. One more time, I'm putting in the chat the program evaluation form. We'd also like to invite you to join us next Thursday. Rabbi Dr. Sonsina will be here to talk about Great Leaders, Great Legends, Part 2. If you've already registered, as you all have for tonight, you should automatically receive the reminder email by 5 p.m. the day before, and we look forward to seeing you there.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.